Oh, good evening, everyone. This, I think, should be a really interesting session. I'm happy to see my old friend Jennifer Berkshire, whom I met, I'd say 11 years ago, back
Wow.
when I was talking about my big turnaround book, when I went from being on the right to moving over to what I call the bright side, from the dark side to the bright side. So, and I'm also thrilled to meet Charles. I've heard so much about you, Charles, through Jennifer's podcast and Jack Schneider's. Uh, and you're going to answer some questions that I've had a hard time answering. People always say to me, or they used to say for years and years, they don't say it anymore. Why did you change your mind? And uh, I say, well, I look at the evidence, and the things that I was saying turned out not to be true. And you have to be open to new facts. And when the facts say you're wrong, you've got to say you're wrong. Um, but then people would say, how do we persuade other people to do what you did? And I didn't have any answers. So you are, I count you as number two in 10, 11 years. And I'm very interested to hear your story of why you changed sides from the Goldwater Institute and representing and lobbying on behalf of the privatization movement to promoting public education. And we're friends of public education and at the Network for Public Education. So I'll be very interested if you tell your story, and then we'll ask you questions about it and ask about how you and Jennifer met. So,
Well, yeah.
for you.
Well, I appreciate that, and I would say it's kind of funny as you were talking, and I was kind of looking at some of my thoughts that I jotted down before doing this tonight. One line that I wrote about why I changed my views is like lines up with one of the things he said, is that the ideals that I felt at the time, that I held at the time, they didn't really match the rhetoric once you looked at the implementation of the policy in a real world place. And then honestly, after seeing that the facts didn't line up with the rhetoric, actually reevaluating even the philosophy that underpinned all that. But it definitely wasn't like an overnight journey or anything. It was something that came late in life or later in life for me. I grew up in a fairly conservative evangelical household. I had a view of government that the best thing that we could do to give people the most opportunity to live their best lives was to get government out of the way and to minimize regulations so that people could live lives as they choose and see fit. And so I really bought into that wholeheartedly. And as I went through life, I even went to school at George Mason University and studied economics there, which is in the libertarian sphere, is a highly regarded school for economics. And if anybody's read Democracy Unchained, you'll hear a lot about George Mason University and their role in sort of igniting the movement of modern day school vouchers, but then also sort of this libertarian right Koch network sort of powerhouse, especially at the state level. And so I'm someone who came from, one, as a true believer, but also someone who sought out how to best prepare myself to be an advocate and a defender of those kind of libertarian ideas. And once I started to work in that policy space, I poured myself into that work. But again, I think just like you said, Diane, is that if you are honest with yourself and you have an open mind and you're interested in exploring and finding the best ways to help people, then it is really impossible to stay in that space. I mean, you have to close yourself off to the reality of what you're doing to continue to feel good about that work. And so I like to think in some ways my ideals and my principles have remained unchanged. it's just that I finally realized through seeing evidence, through having, fortunately, some really great friends and things that engaged with me and brought evidence to my attention, and I was just able to see that it just didn't match up, and so that meant that I had to change, and so that's kind of what got me into this this world of public school advocacy.
Well, yours is a very interesting story, Charles. It's very different from mine because I went to public schools and I really was pro-public school. And then I became more conservative kind of midlife and was part of conservative think tanks like the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, the Correct Task Force of the Hoover Institution. And the Fordham Institute created the PI network, Policy and Education, and they were very involved in all of the networks that you were part of. But my change of mind was really a reversion to where I had come from, whereas you are really stepping away from where you came from. And it's in some ways a much bigger decision for you. And so I know that what didn't line up for me was that I believed in the 90s and in the early 2000s that charters were going to save poor kids from failing schools, that vouchers were going to save poor kids from failing schools. And then I looked around me and saw charters were failing. The kids weren't failing, the charters were failing. And that the vouchers were going to really terrible schools, we're sending kids to really terrible schools. And that wasn't what I wanted. So I can kind of understand how I looked at this and I said, but this isn't what I wanted. I didn't want to send kids to bad schools. And that's
Right.
what I saw. What did you see?
Well, so I'd say I think it was really two kinds of things. One wasn't really that dramatic. It was an inconsistency within the sort of SPN. So if people aren't too familiar, the State Policy Network is sort of a trade association coordinating body that helps all of these different state-based kind of Koch style think tanks work together. Whether it's the Illinois Policy Institute to the Pope Foundation to the Goldwater Institute. I mean, there's one or two in pretty much every state in the country, but even internally, they like at one point I was working on improving fraud controls and accountability measures in cash assistance welfare programs, SNAP, things like that. And so we're really like hammering all of this fiscal accountability and accountability for outcomes and things like that. But then when you look at like the ESA program and you're saying, hey, why aren't we just as like serious about advocating for fiscal accountability, for accountability of outcomes? It's just, there was not only no appetite for it, there's actually like strong opposition to implementing anything that would provide any accountability or oversight. So in like, while I still had those like kind of that mindset, even that was an inconsistency internally. But then the other side, like I said, my honest interest was in helping people. And I think that you can't look at these things and not recognize like the damage they do to any sense of equity whatsoever. When you look at like pretty much all of the academic research creates a pretty strong body of work that shows that you're harming communities of color, you do a lot of harm to the LGBTQ community. I mean, just the amount of discrimination that is advanced when school choice and privatization moves forward is overwhelming, and it's tragic, and really it ends up aligning with so many other things that we can talk about. But one thing that was great was to get connected with Jennifer, just as she was doing some interviews about some different education issues over the summer, because she had a program that really like resonated with me, talking about how public school advocates really didn't understand what it meant to cede ground, how they thought that there was this sort of unspoken contract that like if you if you come to some sort of compromise, that compromise is going to be the place that you end at. When in reality, I recognized as soon as I heard her talking about this, no, like that's just our side moving the needle for where we're going to start the next like series of battles. And so, so yeah, it was really great to get connected with her and Jack and their show, and then her network. So I would say Jennifer has been a fantastic resource for sort of expanding the community to me. So yeah.
So you remind me of a story, and then I'm going to turn to Jennifer. Back in the late 90s, I was working at the Conservative Manhattan Institute, which is part of all these networks. And I actually went to Albany to testify on behalf of charter schools. And the internal discussion was, we have to emphasize that these schools, these charter schools, will be for the benefit of Black and brown children and poor children, because the Manhattan Institute is funded by billionaires and multimillionaires. And it's sort of hard to, when you put this together, do they really care about equity when what they were advancing was privatization, but they knew that they would get Democratic votes by saying it's all about equity. But in
Right.
fact, it was not about equity. It was about creating a new industry. Jennifer, just to turn to you, how did you first get together with Charles?
So I found Charles because I was working on a story about Arizona in the lead up to the election. And I was interviewing somebody who many of you may know, Dawn Penich Thacker from Save Our Schools Arizona, which is a fantastic group. If you don't know them, you should. And Dawn referred to some polling that somebody had done, somebody who was working with a pro-public education candidate. And I said, this is really interesting. Can you put me in touch with this person? And so it turned out to be Charles. And I was immediately intrigued. I could tell that he had a real sense of what was happening on the ground, and that he already understood the splintering in the Republican Party that we're seeing so vividly now, and that he really understood how it related to education. And that as the Republicans became more and more Trumpian, that they were having to basically run against public schools, the same schools that their constituents are in. And I thought that this was really interesting. And sadly, I think we both turned out to be not quite, our hopes about how this would translate into state level electoral gains turned out to be a little bit optimistic, or that we didn't quite account for just how much the really high turnout would dampen some of that. But in the course of our conversation, Charles mentioned this to me about his background. And if those of you who know me know that this is the sort of thing that would just cause me to become very excited. And I made a sound something like this. And Charles and I we became friends. I asked him if he would do me the honor of reading our book, A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, and then coming on our podcast to talk about what we got right and where we didn't quite get it. And one thing he told me that really surprised me was that our focus on labor unions was too narrow, and that actually the goal is much more to really eliminate the capacity for all kinds of collective action. And Charles, I wonder if you would just like pretend we're back there, and I've just asked you about the book, and you kind of lay down that there's this oversight on our part. What were you thinking?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it's pretty easy for a lot of people who are public education advocates to see the attacks on teachers' unions. I mean, it's really out in front, and then you have like the Janus decision, which was pushed by, again, the same network of school choice advocates. But like you have the Mackinac Center in Michigan, which obviously is Betsy DeVos's home state. And so they've been fighting labor issues. They were behind all of the right to work movements and things like that across the country. But like school choice is connected to all of these other issues, because school choice is not a philosophy about schools. It's a philosophy about government. It's not about a vision for education. It's about a vision for what government is. And so all of the efforts, it's the voter suppression the anti-union work, this sort of turning communities into individual customers of education. It's all implemented and advanced to undermine collective power. And the reason they want to do that is that the sort of highest moral or the most sacrosanct moral principle to them is this concept of private wealth and private profit. Because on that side, profit is just a signal that someone has added a great amount of value to the community at large and reaped those rewards. And so that's either through hard or innovative work. And so taxing that wealth is to violate that individual's autonomy to like, it's to them, they talk about it internally, effectively like it's enslavement to tax people. And so that's why they don't just work against public education. I mean, we're talking about the attacks on Social Security, on Medicare, Medicaid, public transit, anything funded with taxes, but even beyond taxes, minimum wage increases. So they see collective power, whether it's through union organizing, through the ballot box. Like they don't want people raising the minimum wage at the ballots. They don't want people mandating maternity leave, any of these things. They don't want to see collective power through families as PTO members. They don't want to see collective power of protesters. All of this to them is just, it is the people who want to take the wealth away from people who've earned it. And so basically they see everybody else as lazy, except when it comes time to mobilize. But I think that that's something that really a lot of public school advocates miss, is how connected this school choice issue and privatization is to really every other thing that they're pushing in the states. And that's why all of it is coming together, especially this year.
Jennifer, I'm going to let you ask the next question because you asked such a good one.
Oh, okay. I hate to step on your toes in your Zoom box, Diane, but
No,
I do love to ask a question.
We're both interviewers. Go right ahead.
So, Charles, I just want you to expand on that a little bit, because I feel to great frustration, like that lesson is really not getting heard right now. That, I'll keep trying to point out on Twitter, like, hey, 23 different states are pushing either expansion of vouchers or introducing new programs, including really sweeping programs. And look, it's almost the identical list of states where all sorts of restrictions on voting are being implemented. Part of the problem, I think, is that so many of our media are in blue states where they're not dealing with these issues, or they really see school choice or school privatization as having to do with the expansion of what they see as high quality charter schools in the urban area. So they're really like, they don't really have any context by which to make sense of something like an enormous ESA bill that's proposing to let parents spend money on whatever they want with no accountability by design. So just talk a little bit about that, like what you see as those, the overlap in the legislative agenda right now.
Well, first I would just say it was no accident or coincidence that the Heritage Institute was like ready to go with recommendations for state education policy changes within a week of schools closing in response to COVID. And I mean, that whole side has just seen COVID as a massive window of opportunity to really cram a lot of these school choice bills like through legislatures across the country. But I mean, it's not just those bills. I mean, in a way, all of this is connected to the transgender athlete bans, to bathroom bills, to bills banning college athletes from engaging in protest, to massive, like in Arizona, they're trying to get rid of our mail-in voting system through our permanent early voter lists by culling the rolls there. They're looking at changing the way people vote in a number of different states across the country. part of the reason they're doing all of these things, like I said a moment ago, was about making sure that people are disempowered from being able to affect change collectively. But also, it is a part of leaning into that sort of shift to the right, the extreme right of the Republican Party, but also the structure of the two-party system leaves these politicians where they can like focus the electorate on cultural issues. Like, oh, you don't want sex ed being taught to kindergartners, do you? And like they know that nobody's like the vast majority of their voting bloc isn't going to actually understand the nuances of what's happening there. And so what happens is you end up having a voting bloc that votes more on like cultural issues or a cultural identity rather than policy. And so when we polled, even when I was at the Goldwater Institute, when we look at like support for public schools versus vouchers and school choice programs, even Republican voters overwhelmingly support public education. And so Republican candidates or Republican legislators who are pushing these things to dismantle and privatize public education are doing so without really the support of their constituents. But that doesn't matter because their constituents aren't going to vote for a pro-abortion Democrat or an anti-gun Democrat. So they just have so much leeway to sort of bend to special interests, especially well-financed special interests that are well organized with a ton of manpower to kind of like push the needle forward in all of these states in a very coordinated way. So anytime I see one of these crazy out there bills, like I just look at how it's connected to reducing equity to, further harming marginalized communities. Even the attacks on like a tribal sovereignty, Western land reform, taking federal lands, a large block of the West is federally managed land. All this stuff is about privatization of these lands and turning them over to private developers while also undermining sovereignty of our indigenous tribes. There's no way to like separate these things out. So when you're fighting against privatization, you're actually part of a larger movement fighting these people on a bunch of different issues. You just might not be aware of it.
Diane, are you ready to take the reins back, or do you want me to ask another question?
I'll ask another question, then I'll come in.
Okay, great. So I think, Charles, one thing that's really hard for us to process on the ground is that you have, on the one hand, these proposals to exempt vast swaths of education from any kind of oversight, right? That like I saw the bill that's under consideration in Missouri, for example, there won't be any report made available about where the voucher money went for 5 years. And in the meantime, you see the same legislators coming up with just increasing levels of intervention in the public schools, right?
Mm-hmm.
The like insisting that students be present in person for testing, or just, in Florida, like basically every minute of the day is planned out, right? And so you see these things moving in seemingly contradictory directions. Help us make sense of that.
Well, like I said, I think that like the thing that seems like a contradiction isn't a contradiction once you understand their purpose, and the purpose isn't to improve education by expanding choice and giving people more opportunities. It's to dismantle public schools. And so what they're trying to do is implement a model of competition. And then, so it's like you're telling the public schools that they need to race against charter schools and race against these private schools or whatever. And then what you do is you weigh down the public schools with all these regulations and other burdens. And then you complain about the administrative costs of implementing all the things that you've like burdened the public schools to have to like do administratively, and talk about how inefficient they are. So I think that like it's intended to cripple the public schools so that they can't compete. And I would say that like I mean, as we've discussed, and I see that Kathy Sigmund from Arizona is on the feed there. She and I have talked a great deal and have worked at developing sort of a way to talk about how education, this concept of it being able to be delivered through a market system, just is totally flawed thinking from a number of ways. But I think that the most important thing to remember is that they're trying to destroy public schools, and that is done by crippling them and making them ineffective as much as possible. And unfortunately for them, so many of like America's public professional educators are incredibly talented, and they have taken on this challenge and still continue to provide an incredible education for so many students despite the assault that is happening in the schools. But one thing that I think is important to remember is when we're looking at the families who are exploring or maybe finding that they're interested in exploring school choice options, is to show empathy for them, because they're trying to make the best choices for their kids in the current environment. And that's one we all recognize is made up of underfunded schools. I mean, like I said, they're still fantastic, but there are definitely families with legitimate issues with their public school system. But that's because we've had a systematic attack that's effectively crippled our public institutions. And so what I was doing when I worked at the Goldwater Institute, what those people are still doing now, is working hard to pit families against families. And so we've been able to connect, or well, not me, but the Save Our Schools Arizona was great at connecting with families all across the state because they showed empathy. And they actually have a number of ESA families working with Save Our Schools to protect public education, because they understand that where they're at is because the schools have been assaulted and defunded for years. Like in Arizona, we're still not even funding per pupil levels at where we were in 2003, and teacher pay is at a 10%, has taken a 10% cut since 1999. And so even though we've had recent increases to teacher pay, we're still behind where we were when I graduated high school. So it's just insane to think that people wouldn't have legitimate issues that they want to have addressed. So I'd say show some empathy for those families, because there's no sense in pitting ourselves against them. They're not the real problem. The problem is the people attacking the institutions and undermining them both from within and without.
So Charles, you mentioned the antipathy of so many of the choice advocates for any kind of protest. And I was reminded of that in West Virginia, the voucher bill there includes a ban on any protest, teacher protest, or any other kind of protest. So they're going to take care of that problem. People won't be able to voice their objection to what the legislature is doing. One of the things that strikes me about this privatization movement is that it's built on what I consider a big lie. We live in an era with a lot of big lies. And the big lie is that public schools are failing. And one way to sell that is we've been hearing it ever since A Nation at Risk in 1983. Our public schools caused auto industries to go to Japan. And it was all because of the children in third grade that the auto manufacturers and Toyota and Honda were taking away market share, which is insane. But lots of people were selling that big lie. It turns out that, if you just look at test scores, which I don't consider a great measure anyway, the test scores today are higher than they've ever been, except that they've been flat for the last 10 years after all of this reform era. But I think it would be interesting to talk a bit about the money behind all this, because we find ourselves, and as I'm sure you do with Save Our Schools and other statewide groups, at a tremendous disadvantage when you go into a school board election, whether it's a referendum or, as there was in Massachusetts, or a state board election or a local school board election, and then you discover that Michael Bloomberg or Bill Gates or Charles Koch or Betsy DeVos or any number of other billionaires have thrown a few million into the pot, making it almost impossible to compete. How do you organize against that kind of money?
I'm not completely sure, to be honest. Unfortunately, I mean, as I've started to talk to more and more groups across the country, I know that people would love to have some kind of silver bullet to like address these different issues, and I'm not sure that one really exists. But the thing that I would say is that they do have a huge advantage in their donor base. I mean, the network of people who donate to these think tanks and these other advocacy organizations pushing for privatization, they're also donating to candidates directly and have close relationships with a lot of candidates. And so when I worked at the Foundation for Government Accountability, or I worked at the Goldwater Institute, I mean, meeting with legislators was, I mean, incredibly easy. I mean, easier than other people. And it was easy just to have a rubber stamp on legislation that I ran through, unless it was too crazy, which even, what's funny is some of the stuff that I ran that might be, or was considered pretty crazy at the time, would probably be middle of the road now. But those networks of donors is a massive benefit to the other side. I think that the big reason that they're pushing so hard for all of these anti-democracy measures is because that is really the one big lever that people have left right now, and that is mobilizing people to vote differently. And the strategy that I think is probably going to be the most effective, it depends on the state, but is in states where voters or the legislature can put things on the ballot so that people can vote on them, like having the voters get involved and make decisions is going to most likely be your most successful avenue, bypassing these legislatures. One, because most people don't have the appetite, nor do they have the time to commit to the really just the mind-numbing metronome of year in and year out lobbying to like constantly fight these school choice bills, because seriously, you're going to be doing it for decades. And if there's ways to amend constitutions in states or to pass legislation that really locks the door, then that would be fantastic. And honestly, that was something that we looked at doing from the other side, is how do we use these different processes, use constitutions to lock the door for public schools and for tax collection and so on. And I think it gets way too weedy to talk to people about, but I would definitely look at Chile under the Pinochet regime. And if you like follow what was done with the Chicago boys there, they worked really hard to write a constitution under that fascist regime that would favor privatization of everything from pensions to public transit to K-12 and higher education. And even after having the Pinochet regime gone for a decade plus and having multiple reform movements come through, they're still dealing with the Constitution that is so limiting that they've had to rewrite it. And so I would say there's a lot of room to actually do things there. And part of the reason I say that is because the electorate is generally overwhelmingly supportive of public schools and almost always anti-privatization, especially vouchers. I am aware of no instance where vouchers have been on a ballot to which they've passed. Pretty much every time they're shot down 2-1 by voters. And it's funny because I hear of polling from different groups that say, oh, voters love vouchers, 70% here once you talk to them about this or that. Yeah, put it on a ballot and see how much they love it. They don't. They shoot it down every time. And so unfortunately, I know that that's not an avenue that's available to every state and whatnot. But at the moment, either through a lack of imagination or experience or insight, I don't have a better idea for you, Diane. So
I want to add one thing about money.
Yeah.
So if you're in a state where the legislature is really pushing aggressively to expand one of these programs or introduce a new one, you're really seeing the effects of all that money, right? It's those op-eds that are appearing week after week. And then, the news media is a shriveled husk of what it once was. And so they're able to they're out there constantly with their talking points. And it just starts to feel so overwhelming. And that's why I think it makes it all the more remarkable that in a number of these states where they really thought they had this thing locked up, they, like Iowa today, right? Like that school choice bill is stalled. New Hampshire, we still don't know what's going to happen there, but Charles went and testified. And I would say that testimony was quite devastating, right? And that so many of the other people testifying were paid lobbyists for school choice groups. And they bank on the fact that legislators aren't going to know enough to be able to ask hard questions. And they're just going to come in and they're going to, they've got the sales pitch and they're going to have all the lines about equity and factory systems and every child is unique. And what you see is that, people are not, opposition in New Hampshire ran something like 6-1. And so the more aggressive that these groups are about pushing bills that really do kind of reveal that the end game isn't just the kind of incremental programs where, okay, we're going to create this standalone voucher programs for kids with special needs. No, what we're looking at in a number of states is these incredibly ambitious programs that basically seek to move as many kids out of the public system as possible. And so that's going before the voters. And in a lot of places, voters are really recoiling. And so, you can buy a lot with that big money operation, but like once you put this thing out there, it's, like if people recoil, no matter how much the legislature may want to not be responsible to their constituents, like this is all happening out in the open, more or less. And then the only other thing I would add to that is that, we're letting the Democrats off the hook with a lot of this stuff because we're talking about the money from the right. We're talking about groups like the one that Betsy DeVos founded, the American Federation for Children. But in a lot of states, what you see happening is that Democrat-funded groups that very much want to see charter expansion in the city are allied with Republicans at the state level. And so they're pumping money into those campaigns because they need state level changes in order to be able to grow their charter vision in the cities. And so that means that as a result of that, you're getting all these other policies at the state level, things like voter suppression. So I just want to throw that out there because I don't think it's getting enough attention, where it's tempting to let the Biden administration off the hook, but a lot of very prominent Democratic donors are still playing a big role in this.
Well, I think this has been a very serious problem for those of us who are supporters and defenders of public education, is that we have Democrats on the other side. And, I can think of prominent Democrats, so whether it's Cory Booker or Hakeem Jeffries or any number of others who have been big charter supporters. And the charter idea is a consumer idea, and it paves the way for the voucher idea. Once you're a consumer, you've already given up on the idea that we all have a civic obligation to support our community public schools, whether or not we have children in public schools. This is we're obligated to do in order to have a better society. The charter idea and the voucher idea are very much related because it's the backpack full of cash idea. So if you have a backpack full of cash, well, what kids choose to do or parents choose to do, that's no concern of mine. I have no obligation because each of them has their own backpack full of cash. I mean, the great joke in all of this is I remember Betsy DeVos saying on many occasions, people with money make choices all the time. Why shouldn't poor children have the chance to make a choice? Well, the rich people are sending their kids to private schools with a tuition of $40,000 to $50,000 a year, and the voucher's worth about $4,500. So the choices are going to be awfully poor. And you mentioned New Hampshire, and I was following the news from there today, and the commissioner there, who's homeschooled his 7 children, said, well, you really don't have to worry about this affecting public schools because hardly anyone's going to take a voucher. I mean, like, no one's going to take a voucher. 1/2%. You know, you look at the numbers around the country, people don't really want vouchers, so don't worry about it. It's the weirdest, most contradictory argument that I've ever heard. But it is a sweeping universal plan to give everybody the money to get education from anywhere they want, and to pay homeschoolers, to pay kids who already are in religious schools. It will cost New Hampshire $100 million a year. And there's a lot of lying going on about how it's going to save money. Well, it won't save money. I guess their idea is that we'll give so little money to these voucher kids that we won't be paying for public schools. But I think that, you know, I think a lot about the messaging. And one of the things that the voucher and charter people advocate is for a free market in education. And I wonder if we could somehow take that free market idea and say the free market never produces equity. This is what has always been my view. You look around the society we live in, and we live in a free market society where hundreds of people are billionaires or multimillionaires, and millions of people don't know if they're going to have food on the table tomorrow. That's the way a free market works. In education, the one principle we've had in public education was equality of educational opportunity, meaning that everybody should have access to a good quality school, and it shouldn't be different based on your family income. And the more we move towards a free market, the more disparate the outcomes and the inputs are going to be. And there is nothing good about a free market in education. But I would ask you, Charles, whether, and I'm sure you've given this a lot of thought because you're in the communications and PR business, what do you think is the best messaging for public education?
Well,
against the attack?
I would love to take more credit here and give you something, but something new and exciting. But I would say, in the experience I've had seeing both sides for at least a few years now, is that the messaging that public school advocates are using is already really solid. I mean, you already have convinced the vast majority of people that public education is great, partially because of their own experience, because so many Americans go, their kids go. I mean, even when you talk to people who are convinced that public schools are failing and are indoctrination centers of liberal propaganda or whatever, they'll tell you like, oh, the schools are just teaching our kids about sex and about like transgender this and that. And then they're like, but I love my kid's teacher and I love my school. And, you know, I can't wait to get them back in there as soon as COVID's done, you know. So I think that like the issue is just breaking through the static and the noise of people's daily lives. I think your messaging is already great, that, you know, you're taking taxpayer funding and you're pulling it out of their public schools and you're giving it to an individual. You know, the privatization robs taxpayers to fund segregation and discrimination. That your tax dollars are buying some wealthy kid's iPad while your school has to have a bake sale to pay for supplies. Like, people understand it. It's just getting them to connect that to their votes for candidates that is a little bit challenging. And like I said, that's because of that unfortunate cultural identity sort of tribal issue about our partisan two-party election system. The one thing that I would say, kind of going beyond that, is like, I think that anything that you go into about like the market failures and how the market doesn't, like a market system doesn't work, not that people can't understand it, it's just really difficult to package those messages in a like concise, effective way that can be repeated as well as what you already have sort of in your toolkit. The thing that I think would be much more effective than trying to develop new messaging is getting better coordination. So like the Network for Public Education is like fantastic at helping people connect across the country. But like when you look at the other side, we've talked about all the money they have, but what does it buy them? It buys them people who can then spend a lot of time repeating the same things over and over and over again to the right people. And unfortunately, that's really hard to do when maybe you're a school board member in Florida working with a PTO, and you don't know that there's a group in Iowa having the exact same fight that you are. And you two could lean into each other and really kind of like multiply your own voices a bit. And that's all they do. I mean, this may be slightly self-deprecating, but like they don't hire the best minds on the other side for a lot of this work. If you start to talk to some of their education policy analysts and things, they don't even know that much about like the way public schools work in their own states all the time, and they like don't even understand the way their own polling works and whatnot. I mean, there are some really talented, intelligent people who have figured out some very sophisticated things to move the needle forward on the privatization side. But say the vast majority of it, they're not rocket scientists, and I don't think that we need to be either. It's just hard to combat that kind of an army of like monotonous advocates. The good thing is that people are already on your side. It's just hard to connect their own values to their votes sometimes when it comes to candidates. And that's why, like I said, I think that if you can get them to vote on issues, you can really do a lot, because you can really get away from that sort of like identity as like, I'm a Republican, I might vote Democrat for Joe Biden, but I'm not going to vote Democrat the rest of the way down, which is something we saw a lot of in Arizona this last election. But yeah, I would love to see find a way to more effectively help all of these public education advocates coordinating across the country, because you all have an army too, and I assure you it's bigger. It's just you probably feel more alone than they do. They don't feel alone. They get to see each other at expensive multi-million-dollar conferences every year. They're constantly traveling. Like I had so many airline miles when I worked there. I was constantly in first class being upgraded. Now I'm back in the back and economy minus, you know. But yeah, I would just say it helps to just work together as much as possible, and amplify each other's voices and learn from what you're seeing in other states. I mean, Arizona is so often the canary in this privatization coal mine, and our bird's been dead for a long time. So hopefully we can revive it.
Well, I think what the proponents of public education did in 2018 was remarkable, and they really squashed the voucher folks. But they said the day after the election, I'm sure the Goldwater Institute said it, and I don't know if you wrote the press release, we'll be back. I mean, they don't care that the public is against vouchers. And now, of course, there's a new voucher bill, and the other side probably doesn't have the money to mount yet another referendum campaign, right? So, I mean, the problem is it comes down to always money. And I'll bet you were making a lot more money then than you are now, because when I was on the other side, there was lots of money from the Hoover Institution, lots of money from this and that and the other. And it was, you know, they're awash in money. They don't even know what to do with all their money. And when young people will sometimes contact me and say, I had a wonderful public education, I love public schools, where can I go to work to be an advocate? I'm stymied. If they said to me, where can I go to work to fight public education? I could think of 100 places they could go to work and start at a very nice salary. But I don't know of organizations. And you know, I can say be a teacher, but that's not what they want. They want to be an advocate. They want to do the kind of thing that you're doing, go to testify and be a research person. And I don't know of organizations that do that other than the unions, and they're staffed up. They're not looking for people.
Well, I really do think that, I mean, you're totally right. Like it is, I've actually said this to friends here in Arizona multiple times. Like it's sad how little money is in defending these fantastic institutions that so many people benefit from. But I think that it is, the pendulum is definitely starting to swing the other way. And I definitely see a lot more people getting engaged because they're pushing so far. like whether they're doing it incrementally like they are in Indiana and Arizona, like building on these programs, whether they're trying to push just a little bit of a toe in the water for the first time, like they did with Iowa or they've been doing in other places, but also Maryland. Then you also have places like New Hampshire that we've touched on, or West Virginia, where they're just jumping right in and pushing for some of these most insanely expansive programs. I mean, they're really just pushing people way too far, I think, at this point, and it is laying bare so much of what they're advocating for. And I think that it isn't too much of a stretch at this point to get people to recognize, like, what they really want to see isn't vouchers. Like, if you pass, I told someone in New Hampshire yesterday, I said, if you pass this voucher program, which would be the most lax and most expansive voucher program in the country, the school choice advocates will be back in New Hampshire next year with a new thing to move further. This isn't the end of it. And it wouldn't be. I mean, you can look at New Orleans, where they have a school district made up entirely of charter schools, and the school privatization advocates are still working to further privatize and dismantle New Orleans' all charter school system. So yeah, if you want to see no public funding for education, if you want to see a student loan market for K through 12, where families take on the financial burden, whether it's immediately or paying back over time to educate their kids, then yeah, go ahead and turn a blind eye to what's happening today. I mean, really what we do today determines the kind of public education fight we're going to be having in 2035. Are we going to be building on great, well-funded public schools? Or are we going to be fighting the craziest unaccountable voucher programs where families are losing money in a loan market to fly-by-night kindergartens, you know? So we get to make that choice. It's just exhausting for people, and I recognize that. So I don't know how all of you stay so fueled to keep this fight up. So I'm learning that from all of you, which is impressive.
The truth is, Charles, that some of us are powered by a sense of rage at the theft of public property. It's like, they're stealing the commons and they belong to all of us. And they're just in broad daylight putting up gates with an admission fee to something that we all own already. But I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, but how do you connect the things we're talking about to how people vote? Now, I understand that Republicans have a lock on the culture war issues. Schools are indoctrinating kids into socialism, and everyone's going to turn gay and transgender and so forth. And the bathrooms will be available to boys will go into girls' bathrooms, etc. But still, people won't like their public schools. And as you said, every voucher referendum, I think there have been about 23, 24, has gone overwhelmingly against vouchers. And then nonetheless, there was a voucher referendum in Florida. I think it was 2012. It went 55-45. And the only reason it was so close was because Jeb Bush called it the Religious Freedom Amendment. And you had to vote against religious freedom. I mean, like 55% of the people voted against religious freedom. But still, people do like their public schools, but they don't connect it to voting for their state legislators and their congressmen.
And before you start your answer, Charles, after this, we have so many questions in the hopper. Okay. So after this, we're gonna move to audience questions.
I'll keep it short then. First, you said you're fueled by rage, and I would just say, like, yeah, having kind of switched to the right side, I've definitely seen first person why so many societies hate and try to stifle women's anger, because it is a powerful, powerful tool. Yeah, Diane, I wish I knew how to help connect these issues to people's votes on public education. It's complex, and I haven't figured it out yet. I promise you, when I do, or if I do, or if somebody else, hopefully, I mean, there's plenty of people much, much smarter than me thinking about this as well. But once we figure it out, like I want to tell everybody I know about it. So I will keep
I
my
just
ear
hope-
to the
I
ground.
just hope, Charles, that we can get you to testify before every state that's considering enacting one of these voucher bills.
Hey, I would love to, because every time I do, I know it pisses off people I can't stand here in Arizona. So that fuels me. So
So we're going to start with questions now. Marla's going to read them, but I want to throw in my question. I want to put mine on top. And that's something that is, as you look at the long game of this. So if their ultimate goal is to move to a system with backpack funding, where kids get a certain amount of money from taxpayers to then shop for a school, do you believe, Charles, that then what the next step will be to reduce the amount of money in that backpack until parents are actually paying for schools themselves?
absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, one, that's the only real direction to be able to go further in. The other side of it is loose. So, I mean, pretty much every voucher program that gets proposed or passed prohibits the state from enforcing anti-discrimination measures or changing the creeds, admissions policies of these private schools. They fit that in there. And so one of the things that I have that I think is moving for a lot of people is when they start talking about the backpack, like what do these kids and families have to leave behind to take this backpack with them? And they got to leave their federally protected IDEA rights. I mean, in Arizona, if you want to apply for an ESA, you have to sign a document waiving your federal protections under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. A lot of people don't know that. You lose mandatory reporters, you lose access to a wealth of resources from free and reduced lunches to, I mean, it just runs the gamut, because we've asked our schools to do so much and try to solve so many problems in our communities beyond education that they've become adept and rather skilled at providing a bunch of wraparound services, a wide range of wraparound services. So I would just say that it's scary what you already have to leave behind to take that backpack with you, but they want to reduce taxation. That's it. That's why, I mean, we passed, voters in Arizona passed a tax increase to fund public education just this year. And already we're seeing offsetting tax cuts by the legislature to mitigate the impact of the voter passed tax increase. I mean, voters tax, they've said they want to pay more money out of their own pockets for public schools, and the legislators are finding a way around it. So yeah, I absolutely think they would love to see a student loan market for K-12. It's a financial opportunity for profit. It also forces families to invest what they value in education, which is what they see as kind of like the most effective way to determine efficacy of delivery. So yeah. This would not be the last step. And honestly, one of the crazy bills that I tried to push at the Goldwater Institute that didn't get anywhere, even with Arizona's legislature, was one that would have privatized or put every city and municipal service up for competitive bidding. So like every city would have had to bid, like allow bids for policing, for trash, for parks management, this and that. So it's not just the schools they want to privatize. That's just a really big thing, you know, that they want to privatize.
Hey, Marla.
All right, we have a lot of really, really good questions. So the first question is from Caitlin Rollo, and Caitlin asks, recently the National Republicans flat out said that one of their main tactics over the next 2 years is to harness the COVID school closures to regain the suburbs. From your perspective, how does this play into the long game to defund public education in this country?
Well, I think that there's a couple things. One that's interesting is you've even seen a lot of like progressive or left-leaning parents coming out pushing for school reopenings and in-person schooling, I really should say. In Arizona, we haven't had closed schools. They've been teaching remotely, and across the country, teachers have been working. But it is unfortunate because what they're able to do is leverage the failure of that they've basically our government doesn't care for its citizens very well. And the pandemic and COVID has really highlighted the absolute failures of our social safety nets. And so we forced families to really to rely on public schools for childcare, for getting to work, for having opportunities to earn an income. And so families are stressed and strained and trying to find solutions for themselves. And so what they're able to do is pit teachers, like I said at the beginning, like when you talk to even the craziest Republican who might think that like the schools are terrible, they still love their school and their teacher. Well, right now, a lot of people see their teachers as the impediment to getting their kids back in school. And so this is probably the one like moment of opportunity for these privatization advocates to actually drive that wedge there in a place that's been impossible for them to get. And so that's what's scary to me about it. The other side of it that's scary to me is that we're making our teachers feel so undervalued that how many of them are going to want to come back and continue teaching? And so this exodus that we see from the classroom is really detrimental to the quality of education over time as well. And I think that actually like the employment side of public education could end up being one of the like most critical issues endangering public education as an institution. So I think that there's a dangerous opportunity for privatizers on sort of two sides of this COVID coin, from driving that wedge between even progressive families and their teachers and driving teachers out of the classroom permanently.
Great.
I don't think it's great.
Yeah, our next question is from Allison Harbin. And she asked, she supposed her question boils down to, how are we reconciling conservative policy on education, which is to say privatization, with the very real financial reality that the privatization movement in education was created by white Republicans for other white Republicans to reap enormous profit off the exploitation of minority youth? And she's interested in how these efforts intersect with anti-racist actions and the reality that there are no minority voices in this conversation. It seems to her that those are the very voices we should be seeking out.
There's a lot in that question. I will do my best to answer it. I mean, one, like the modern school choice movement, I'm sure everybody here knows, is super connected to a backlash to Brown and like federal desegregation orders. No mystery to this group. That's still the same thing driving it now. It's allowed a marriage of one racists and then people who, I mean, I would say they're still racist, but they're not driven by racism as necessarily a policy goal, but who want to see minimal government. And without like going too far in one direction or another, but trying to stay focused on your question, I would say that they're still deeply intertwined. Like the reason that we even have this voucher discussion is because of racists wanting to implement and sort of create segregated education systems, two-tiered education systems, and to defund an institution that has so much potential to be a driver and has been a driver of equity in our communities. One of the reasons, actually, we're starting to see a lot of people of color on both sides of this issue, advocating both for privatization, because when I worked at the Goldwater Institute or in any of these other organizations, like I was looking for people of color. I was looking, like if you could find me a Black person to come on and talk about like why they wanted vouchers, I would write so many op-eds and put their name on it. I would take their picture and shoot videos of them. They would be the face of it. Like, I mean, we want politically sympathetic people to be the face of these things. That's why so often when it's an incremental change to these programs, it's special needs children, it's families, first responders or service members or whatever. I mean, they're just looking for any sympathetic population they can use as leverage to exploit the political system in their state to enact these changes that in the long run are going to serve to the detriment of those marginalized communities. But yeah, I would just say, when you do see them, it's because they're being effective at that. And honestly, I think that you're also seeing some backlash to some of these people of color and other groups like being exploited or at least being pushed to the forefront. Like in Arizona, again, like I keep going back to that state because it's one that I'm most familiar with. But so we're seeing a huge backlash from the Black community, with different leaders from religious groups and other things, like speaking out against privatization, because the current debate is how vouchers are a civil rights issue, and it's disgusting. And just listening to these legislators talk it's incredibly revolting. But so I hope I answered your question. You had a lot in there.
It was a great question, and I think considering along that lines, Sue Woltansky asks, do you think the massive Black Lives Matter protests frighten the privatizers into thinking the citizenry might rise up together against their conservative ideas? And some of what we're seeing in the state legislature right now is a reaction to that.
Well, so one, I would say that like we're seeing a lot of anti-protest bills across the country, because again, it's another form of collective organizing and action. I mean, if you can destroy or dismantle every other form of collective action. So let's say you work in a factory and you want to increase your wages, and so you use a union to help you bargain for greater wages. So they come in and destroy the union. So you can't do that anymore. Now maybe you go to the ballot box and you raise the minimum wage, and they're like, no, we don't like that. So they get rid of the ballot box option, Maybe then you have going to the streets to protest about working conditions. And so then they got to cut that out too. I mean, what they want to do is leave people with no other avenues except through leverage of wealth, because if you've already got the money and the wealth, then you can control things in a system like that. So, yeah, they're scared anytime people come together in any capacity. And so I mean, I haven't been in that community since the like larger protest post the George Floyd's killing and whatnot, and over the summer. But I mean, I still have friends in that community, and I would say that yeah, there's definitely a fear there about the power of people being organized and working together. And especially, again, it's funny, they talk about wanting to help all these marginalized groups on one side with the school choice issue, but then you look at who they're disenfranchising at the ballot box, and it's the same people that they say they're trying to help. It's just the most disingenuous rhetoric, and it falls like apart under the like lightest of examination. So yeah, they're definitely scared of anything people do together.
Okay. We have another question from Julia Sharp. Now, Julia's from St. Pete, Florida, and she asks, her state is most recently purple. She says blue in high density population and red in the rural communities. And she wants to know, why would rural families support voucher expansion when their only choice is likely to be a public school? Their Republican legislatures are underfunding their primary educational option.
I mean, it's a great question. One, I'm not entirely sure. I would say one side of it is religious in nature. I mean, a lot of rural communities. I mean, I have lived in small towns in North Carolina and other places as I grew up, in small towns in Mississippi. And I mean, you really, if you don't live in a place like that, it can be hard to understand like how much like church and whatnot plays a role in people's lives. And churches have schools and other things. So, but I think it really gets more to the culture side of it that I was talking about with the election, like with the way people vote and see things, than like the issue specifically itself. And then, to be honest, like beyond that, I really haven't seen enough information or data to really speak like in an effectively educated way about it. But definitely there's a huge cultural divide, and you're right, like it's one thing that in some states I mean, you point this out to a lot of the Republican legislators that represent these rural districts, and sometimes they get it. You know, I mean, there's not the funding to help get these students to a private school or some option. That's where the rise of micro schools and things can be so frightening, because the lack of regulation around them. I mean, you could legitimately have a person with firearms in their home, or unsecured pharmaceuticals, or even just a pool without a fence on it, and maybe they're like letting some neighbor stay at their house or some distant relative while they're teaching your kids in their living room. Yeah, the school choice movement is happy to try to spread their access out to these rural communities, but yeah, I can't. I beyond the cultural side of it, I don't know why they vote that way.
Great. We have another question from Greg, and Greg has a bit of a narrative before the question, and then I'm going to read that, and then I'll ask the question. So he says he does not disagree with anything that Charles cited, but he notes that the problem is that those who should be our natural allies have been bamboozled by big money, as Diane and Jennifer pointed out. He knows no public education advocates in state legislators or Congress who have built coalitions or been willing to call out their colleagues for their hypocrisies. DeVos was the most unpopular member of the past administration, yet we got no political benefit from this. Where are the voices who will point out the views of people like Booker, Jeffries, and others who are completely in agreement with DeVos and her allies?
I'm probably the wrong person to ask that question to, because
okay, I'll throw that to Diane or Jen if you want to take it.
I would just say that, like, I mean, to me, as someone coming out of this libertarian side and like starting to look at like the impact of rhetoric and policy in the real world, like Democrats look like Republicans to me, like most of the time. And I mean, I think that there's definitely some advantages on reproductive rights and other issues when it comes to Democrats versus Republicans, but on so many other things, they're really not that different. And so, so I don't know how you get them to call each other out, but really, like, American politics is so conservative that I think that a lot of Americans don't even realize that, like, the left, like Bernie Sanders would be a conservative in British politics. It's just crazy that we don't even have really a good frame of reference for how far to the right we are. And so that includes our Democrats to me. But that being said, I definitely think you're right to have Diane or Jennifer try to tackle the rest of that.
I'll say a little bit about that, because I actually disagree with that assessment. Disagree with Greg laid it out in a very bleak way. And I think it's really important to acknowledge just how much the ground has shifted since the Obama era. And that one way we can see how much the ground has shifted is all the stuff that Biden is doing outside of schools, that if they are enacted, and it looks like a number of them will be, are gonna dramatically improve the lives of kids. And I'm thinking about the child, the direct benefit to parents. I'm thinking about the fact that he's come out swinging as a pro-union president. That's something, I don't know if anybody remembers just how mealy Obama was when Scott Walker really went to war against the teachers union and other public sector unions in Wisconsin. We're not in the same moment. And what DeVos did was basically sort of rip the Band-Aid off. She made that coalition of Democrats and Republicans around things like charter schools and accountability impossible to hold together. Now, our big problem today is that the Democrats really have no vision of what public education should look like. And so one of the reasons that we're really on the defense is that the Republicans took power in a lot of legislators in 2020, or they, some of them now have sort of trifecta rule. They gained seats. And so they've come out swinging with a very, very aggressive agenda. And you'll notice, like, they're not talking about things like value added for teachers. They're talking about standardized testing only as a way to sort of punish public schools during the pandemic. But they've lost interest in a lot of the things that they were very gung-ho about during the Obama years. And so I think this is a huge opportunity for groups like the Network for Public Education to really push Democrats to articulate a progressive and positive vision of what public education could be. I see, Cory Booker and some of the politicians who are most allied with DeVos working furiously to try to erase that history. And so this is a great opportunity for us to really push the Democrats, and it's got to be a broad-based movement. It can't, our big mistake is that we're left only with the unions to sort of carry the water for public schools. It's been a disaster. And Diane, I'm curious about how you see this with your you have a perspective that dates back further than that. I don't want to make you sound like an older person, but you've really watched this pendulum over, through successive administrations. So how does it look to you?
Well, it obviously is upsetting to see so many state legislatures considering sweeping voucher programs. But I do think that there has been a sea change in the sense that Democrats have moved away from privatization. And during the Obama years, we had Arne Duncan and President Obama. I voted for President Obama. I thought he was wonderful in everything but education. But to see him out there not helping the unions, the day that, well, let's say during the March of 2011 protest in Wisconsin, the building in the Capitol was encircled by tractors and protesters. And Obama was in Miami meeting with Jeb Bush to celebrate the turnaround of a school, which it later was revealed was on the failing schools list, which hadn't been turned around at all. But he was reaching out so much across the aisle that there was no difference between Obama and George W. Bush on education. And he often said that he built Race to the Top on the foundation of No Child Left Behind. So I think that Biden has given us hope that he's willing to abandon that. His decision on testing makes us think he hasn't abandoned it, and he has too many of the old Obama retreads in his administration. So we'll have to see how that works out. But I do think what we see in the polling is that where charters and vouchers are popular with Republicans, they are not popular. Vouchers definitely not popular with Democrats. And the majority of Democrats are opposed to charters. That's a big thing. That's a big change. So I think that what lies ahead is a continuing battle to make the Democratic Party stand up for public education. I was just thinking, listening to Charles, that there are all kinds of caucuses in Congress, and there really should be a public education caucus. So those who are unwilling to say, I'm on the public education side, will be very few and very isolated. Right now, they are in key positions, and they're able to hide in various ways. And we should push with our friends in Congress to create a public education caucus to fight specifically against the privatization of any public institution. I wanted to add something to what Charles said earlier about rural Republicans. Our friends in Texas, the Pastors for Texas Children, have developed a brilliant strategy. They've stopped vouchers again and again. They have another battle coming up again this year because they never give up. But their strategy has been to combine rural Republicans who value their public schools and urban Democrats who don't like privatization. And they have been able to put these two groups together. And I'm going to be speaking later this month to a group of school boards in a suburban and Republican area of Texas. And my pitch is going to be, it's not conservative to privatize your public schools. Conservatives conserve, they don't destroy. But the people who destroy things are anarchists. Conservatives conserve. So your public school is part of your community. It's the heart of your community. And that's got to be the pitch. But I do see that compared to where we were during the Obama years, I mean, it was obviously dreadful during the Trump years, except that Betsy DeVos was such an incredibly wonderful target. And as you said, she kind of stripped the lipstick off the pig and did so in such a blatant way that I always thought she was the gift that keeps on giving. But during the Obama years, we were in more trouble because it was very hard to fight the Democratic Party and say that many charters are low performing, and the ones that are high performing are cherry picking their kids, and they're paving the way for vouchers. And the media totally bought into this charter narrative. And I think now there's a little bit more skepticism as the word gets out that they don't outperform public schools. They're not sources of innovation. And in New Orleans, which is their they're the star of the charter movement, half of the schools are rated D or F, and those D or F schools are the choices available to Black kids. They're almost overwhelmingly Black. They're highly segregated.
Okay. I will turn it over to you, Carol.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'd like to thank everybody for coming this evening. This has been absolutely fascinating. I've been looking forward to it all week. And thank you. Thank you very much for Charles for sharing your wisdom and experiences with us. I hope that we can come back to you in the future. And to Jennifer, you're always terrific, and everybody should buy A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, as well as Slaying Goliath, though I have a suspicion that everybody on this call probably already has Slaying Goliath. Diane, thank you very much. And this will be available on YouTube starting tomorrow, and Darcy and Marla will get that link around. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
And
Thank
Charles,
you.
thank you for your courage.
Thank